Hi, I'm Lauren.
Hi, I'm Faisal.
I'm Marc.
I'm Olivia.
I'm Parker.
Our group is gonna spend the next 10 or 15 minutes talking about the Peloponnesian War, which happened around 430 BC. During this time, Pericles thought it was safer for everyone if all of the residents outside the Long Wall came in, not knowing that there was going to be the Plague of Athens, which killed about 25% of the population. We're going to discuss similarities and differences between that plague and the current plague that we're going through right now and how it relates to democracy. So one of our first questions is, do you think it was wise of Athens, under the advice of Pericles, to draw the citizens into the walls? Olivia, you got anything to say about that?
Yeah, I can start with this. I definitely think that they didn't know that a plague was going to occur, and I think given like the state of medicine at that time, it was hard to predict that overcrowding would lead to anything more than just a lot of trash and debris and things like that. It was really hard to predict whether or not something, or you can't really like foreshadow a plague occurring. So I think in terms of military strategy, it was pretty wise of Pericles just to ensure the safety of the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War. But again, it's really difficult to kind of foresee something like a plague coming in and destroying a quarter of your population.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I agree, if you don't mind. And I don't think that Berkeley's advice to Athens, I thought it was not helpful in the long run, as it encouraged like the spread of disease, since Sparta had great land power and cutting off their transportation and supply lines would result in low chances of victory from Spartans. And so under Pericles' advice, Athenians retreated behind the city walls of Athens. Meanwhile, like Athens' superior navy power worked to fight off the Spartans' troops and cutting off their transportation lines, although I don't think it worked. So this method would have been clever had it not been for the plague, gathering people from both the city and the country within the city walls enabled Athens to become a breeding ground for disease.
So you didn't think it was smart for him to bring everyone in?
No.
So I thought about it from both sides, like what would he have done? Like what would have happened if Pericles hadn't brought everyone in? And my thought immediately went to, would Sparta have killed everyone outside the walls anyways? Or would they have, I don't know, like they did in a different Greek city, I don't remember which one, they killed off all the men and then sold the women and children into slavery. So like there's that kind of, we don't know what Sparta would have done if they had come across all these people,
I think the point too is that Pericles didn't have in mind that a plague would occur because the knowledge of medicine was not developed at this time, but his military knowledge was there, and he did know that Sparta was a threat during this war. So his choice to bring everyone inside the walls was based on the decision that, oh, Sparta is a threat. If we move everyone inside, then we'll protect them from the Spartans. But then all of a sudden, it's a double-edged sword, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's this plague. And Pericles, the funny thing is, he died because of this plague. So it's an interesting dynamic, because the knowledge that was required to know the best decision and how, and I'm unsure what to make of that and how that would go about if they had the knowledge about the medicine and if the plague were to occur. And yeah, if they would know prior to it occurring, I don't know.
Marc, I think that's a really good point, but I do kind of want to add in, it wasn't just Pericles making the decision, it was a whole council that he was advising and making this argument to, and it was a huge council of over 500 people that made this decision. It wasn't just him. So it's not like it's very poetic to wax about how it's like there's irony to the fact that Pericles died because of an unhygienic situation he put all of Athens in, but it wasn't just him. He supported this idea to other people that followed through with it. And I think that's kind of interesting to compare to how how the emergency situation of like COVID-19 today went about. Like, we didn't have a democratic ruling on how we addressed the current pandemic. And in their situation as well, democracy can only address an emergency situation so much, but it's interesting to kind of compare how we'd like to pin things on one person, even if it wasn't one person, but in our situation today, it might be one person, you know, and kind of like looking between the two and how we, you know, addressed it in both cases.
Yeah, so that's actually a very good transition into our next question, which is, what are the lessons to be learned from the transmission of disease in Athens, and what was its effect on the democracy back then, and what has it been on our democracy now? Marc, you want to start us off on this one?
So what are the lessons learned? That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the lessons learned, we have to kind of question what was going on. So in the plague, you have everyone dying, you know, rich, poor, all classes of, you know, aristocrats, oligarchs, everyone. And, you know, today, the same is occurring, but I thought a lot about this. In COVID-19, you know, while anyone can get the virus, I feel like we have politicized COVID-19 and that we're treating it very differently, and that we're not learning, you know, the same lesson that we can from the plague, in that, you know, we're not unifying in the same sense that Athens probably had to at that time to overcome something that was not discriminating against anyone in that instance, right? Is that they were literally like doing away with funeral rights. They were doing away with everything because this was taking precedent. And, you know, today I just see a very, very, you know, line in the sand drawn between which side you fall on. And it's very much like, I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, but I hope someone else can kind of add on to this. But I think that the lesson we can learn is we have to come together and work on this together, in the sense that it does not, COVID-19 as a virus and the plague per se, does not discriminate against individuals and who can get it.
I think it's interesting that you brought up the fact that Athens like unified, because I read a quote from Thucydides when I was doing a little research on this that said, the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen to them next, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. Orderly Athenians, no longer expecting to live long enough to face punishments for crime, plunged into a state of unprecedented lawlessness.
Yeah, kind of going off that quote a little bit, I just think one of the biggest impacts that this pandemic or this plague that had in Athens was just the kind of breakdown of democracy, given that Athens was one of the first and few places that were really having a pretty true direct democracy. And you kind of see, like you just described, kind of the breakdown of the system that was occurring within the city. Just as people were dying and bodies were piling up, there was really kind of a weakening of the state, of the city state. And so you really see that, like, that degradation of the state kind of affecting all aspects of society, and really affecting the politics of the society.
Olivia, I did a reading before this, and there was a quote in it from the funerary oration that Pericles gave like right before the plague came about. And it goes, "We are not suspicious of one another. A spirit of reverence pervades our public acts. We are prevented from doing wrong by respect for the authorities and for the laws." So this was what Pericles was saying about the Athenian citizens just like a year before this plague happened, not even, like months before this plague happened, and then it all flipped on its head. And I'm sure that all of the Athenians like had an identity crisis about, we thought that we were this, and Pericles told us we were this, and we wanted to believe it, but then, like, given the opportunity to prove themselves, they didn't, and everyone just started acting really selfishly. And I think maybe that's kind of similar to the American spirit and how we'd like to view ourselves as like a collective, like United States. But like when the pandemic came, we all just started buying out toilet paper because we were very scared that in our own households, things were going to go poorly. And I think that's kind of a startling similarity from then to now that we can still see.
So like many people back in Athens had the death is inevitable mindset, and they ran out of patience. So purposely breaking the law, especially rules regarding the plague, was common occurrence. And like the financial situations back then also encouraged people to act recklessly, as one of my teammates mentioned. And those who lost money and their businesses were angry and broke the rules or broke the rules to look for other jobs. That's what I had to add.
I know they also stated, sorry, in the reading that there's kind of this idea that people believed like the gods had abandoned them. And I think that kind of like ties into the idea of like COVID today, where they're kind of thinking like that their leaders abandoned them and kind of allowed for this kind of like lawlessness or this breakdown of power, kind of the breakdown of society as, you know, a pandemic or as a plague, you know, occurred. I think there's like a lot of similarities there.
All right, we're coming to the end of our 15 minutes, but one last question I have is Thucydides talked about immigrants and the impoverished and how they were widely neglected. They were living in the streets. They were living in terrible conditions. They couldn't find housing. And so to what extent do you think that kind of mirrors how essential workers and disadvantaged socioeconomic groups today are, how they're being treated and how they feel about the current plague that we're having?
I'll start with this. So many workers today in the retail and restaurant sectors were let go from their jobs without pay. In some cases, their socioeconomic status prevented them from finding another job easily. And if they happened to find a job, the pay was lower and the benefits decreased. This common scenario, as well as the general effects of the current pandemic, causes people to grow restless and impatient, leading them to break the rules, as we saw with the protests. We still see some people today not wearing masks, which poses a greater threat to essential workers in the healthcare business, as well as general businesses, as it encourages the transmission of the disease. So I think that there's a relation.
And I just want to say one quick comment about this. I'm kind of seeing those that were stuck living in the streets and living in the poor conditions as similar to those in the lower socioeconomic groups in the United States today. But back then, they didn't have the knowledge that we do now. But even so, we have all this knowledge about it. Like Faisal said, people aren't wearing masks because they, I guess, don't care about other people and like the science behind the masks. But the people that lost their jobs and can't find a new one, they might not be able to buy like hand sanitizer and wipes. They might be more focused on simply just buying food for their family. And so that kind of inability to, even though we have the knowledge of what we can do to help slow it, they simply can't because they just can't afford some of the basics. So
I kind of wanted to wrap this back around to the Greek history a little bit. In regards to the immigrants in the ancient Greek city, it was the people that were coming in that didn't have a place to stay, and they would either be in these wood huts, and there would be many of them in there, or Thucydides kind of cites how some of them would like gather around the fountains and throw themselves into the rain tanks. And there was this result of these neglected people coming in, and they were impoverished and didn't have a place to stay. And the direct result was that the plague got worse because they weren't being taken care of and the society was not addressing the larger problem. And I think that kind of reflects the attitude towards essential workers. And maybe we'll look back at this like 20 years from now and be like, we really let that large percent of the population go on and we didn't make steady efforts to help them, knowing that they were at a much greater risk and we didn't help them, And I think it would be upsetting if we looked back and we saw those like people throwing themselves in rain tanks and we saw it happening and we didn't do anything about it.
All right, so I think we kind of came to the end of our 15-minute time limit. I just want to say thank you to you guys for making the time to get here.